Greetings out there to all you podcast listeners. This is Tony Denton coming to you again from the Phoenix, Arizona area on this August 14th to share with you this week's installment of my audiobook series of my physical book called Hebrews From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. A book that you can obtain if you just email me at tedenton64@hotmail.com. tedenton64@hotmail.com. This week we're on lesson 29 out of 37. It begins on page 229 of the book, and it is the section called Hebrews chapter 11 verses 20 through 31. So let's begin. In the previous section, Paul began displaying faith's hall of fame, wherein, per chapter 12, 1 and 2, he portrayed his Jewish Christian readers as runners in a race within the confines of a coliseum. And within the stadium seats were all the faithful who had run the race before them, cheering them on to victory. Here's the picture. Each generation of the faithful, at least from Abel, chapter 11, verse 4, to the fulfillment of the promise, chapter 11, 39 and 40, were in a relay race for the prize of reconciliation to God. In this scenario, the baton was in the hands of the first century and last generation of Jewish brethren, and they were on the verge of reaching the finish line. They were winning for all who had gone before them, and more, those of us who came after them. When we view it in this manner, we can see how tremendously important it was that these brethren keep pressing on. It wasn't just for their salvation as individuals that they were running, but it was also for each and every child of God before them and after them. Having begun this survey with Abel and making it through to Abraham, chapter 11, verses 4 through 19, the study continues from Isaac through Rahab in verses 20 through 31 today. The faith of the next three men, verses 20 through 22, that is Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, wasn't only spoken of when they were facing death, but also while facing death when they had not received the things promised, something upon which these Hebrews definitely needed to ponder. So, verse 20, by faith Isaac, when he was dying, blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. In reference to his faith and the promises of God, chapter 10, verse 36, and in reference to his faith in things he had not seen but only hoped for, chapter 11, verse 1, Isaac blessed, that is, he consecrated or set apart his twin sons for service. In other words, Isaac sanctified each one of them for the individual part he'd fulfill within God's promises to Abraham about his posterity. Although blind Isaac was initially upset that he had blessed Jacob as the leader instead of Esau, he didn't revoke it, but trusted that it happened just as God intended. So as Isaac blindly trusted that God's will would be achieved, even if he didn't understand how or why it would be executed differently than he expected, these brethren needed to trust that God was in control even of those things they couldn't see or understand. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped God, leaning on the top of his staff. This time Jacob, renamed Israel by God, in reference to his faith and the promises of God forwarded to him by his father Isaac, and in reference to his faith in things he also didn't get to see but only hoped for, blessed Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob, who was going blind like his father and who, no doubt remembering his father at this point, just trusted that he'd bless these boys as God desired them to be blessed, whether he could see them or not. As in Isaac's case, the younger was again blessed as being greater than the firstborn. God was in control, so all things worked out as planned. So yes, thinking about the concept of Calvinism that we've talked about from time to time through the book of Hebrews, during the Old Covenant times, during the time when God was working out his plans to bring about conciliation for man to him, he was directly involved in such ways as this. That's why people like Isaac and Jacob could feel the way they did and believe the way they did, because God was directly operating and making things happen the way he needed them to happen. Once his design, purpose, and plans were fulfilled, then all of that came to an end. Well, I will stop right there with that little addition and move on. The phrase "worshipped God" makes one wonder if Paul was thinking about how Jacob gave God praise, even though he knew he would die before the promises were fulfilled. The "worshipped," leaning on the top of his staff part of this statement, very likely refers to an earlier event, Genesis 47, which occurred when Jacob had Joseph swear that he would bury him in Canaan, the promised land, not in Egypt where he died, for Canaan was where Jacob's faith told him that God's promises would be fulfilled. Besides, his father and grandfather, Isaac and Abraham, were already buried there. This interpretation leads perfectly into verse 22, where it goes on to say, "By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure," literally the exodus, "of the children of Israel, and gave instructions concerning his bones." The phrase "made mention" is from a term meaning to recall or remind. So, as he was dying, Joseph not only remembered God's promises regarding Abraham's posterity and reminded Israel of them, Genesis 50:24, but he also informed them about God's prophecy regarding their deliverance from Egyptian bondage, which would soon be fulfilled. And when that occurred, Joseph, like his father, wanted to be buried in Canaan. So he instructed Israel to take him with them when they left Egypt for the promised land, Genesis 50:25, and they, of course, complied, Joshua 24:32. Joseph, a great example of unwavering faith or faithfulness in the midst of terrible trials, said at the end of his life that God meant it all for good, Genesis 50, verse 20. Thus Joseph, like all those Paul had already mentioned, not only lived in faith, but also died in faith, verse 13. Would these Hebrews follow in the footsteps of their honorable forefathers? Let's go ahead and read on now. At verse 23, where Moses is now brought up. "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command." The word "beautiful" is from a term which means comely. To whom was Moses comely? To God. Stephen, using the same original term, said of Moses that he was well-pleasing to God, Acts 7, verse 20. God evidently revealed to Amram and Jochebed, Moses' parents, that Moses was important to him and to Israel. So knowing by faith that God was with them, Moses' parents hid him. Just as Moses' parents weren't afraid of Pharaoh because God was on their side, so these brethren should not be afraid of politicians like Nero or the great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. Verses 24 and 25 now, still talking about Moses, Paul went on to say, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin." The clause, "when he became of age," meant when he was 40 years old, Acts 7:23, indicating that, according to custom, when Moses became old enough to fully exert his faith, he, by his own free will, refused royalty and riches, joining himself to his native people, the poor and suffering Israelites. Plenty of opportunity for the pleasures of sin could be found in Pharaoh's court and in Egypt, especially when power and wealth were possessed. But Moses was wise enough to know that those pleasures were fleeting in nature, while the oaths of his God, about which his mother informed him no doubt, Exodus 2, 1-10, were everlasting in nature. Likewise, these Hebrew brethren, like Paul, needed the attitude of Moses. Paul's attitude can be found in Romans 8:18 when he wrote, "I consider that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us." Probably one reason Paul used Moses as an example was to show that there's no middle ground. Just as Moses sided with his people by slaying the Egyptian, so there was no middle ground for these Hebrews, meaning they couldn't return to Judaism and concurrently be neutral about Jesus. They either truly believed in him and his imminent return to fulfill God's promises, or they didn't. It was that simple in the mind of Paul. So verse 26 goes on to say about Moses, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked toward the reward. Many, perhaps even most, of the sufferings that Abraham's posterity, God's people, endured were due to who they were. In other words, they likely experienced more captivities, etc., than any other nation from the time of Abraham to Israel's demise in AD 70 because they were God's people through whom would come the promised Messiah. But was it because the other nations knew they were God's favorite people and so were jealous? Probably not. As one reads through the Old Testament, it appears that God himself was behind most of their negative, as well as their positive, circumstances for the grand purpose of successfully bringing his promises to fruition through Jesus. This means that not only did Yahweh arrange things so that the nations of the world would be in existence in a certain fashion when the Christ arrived, Nahum 2:21, but he also arranged things so that the religious world of the Jews would be in existence in a certain fashion when the Christ arrived, Hebrews 11:3. Everything had to be poised and timed perfectly. The phrase, the reproach of Christ, was obviously used here in reference to any persecution that anyone suffered who was connected with the promise of God. In other words, the suffering of God's people, verse 25, was equal to the reproach of, or due to the coming, of Christ, verse 26. Check out the idea of Jesus blaming Saul for persecuting him when he was actually doing so only indirectly by persecuting his people, Acts 9, verse 4. Also see Acts 7:55. Unlike many of these Hebrews, Moses considered that his maltreatment for God would only result in greater riches than all the treasures of Egypt. In 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17 through 18, Paul similarly wrote, "Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen, such as our afflictions, are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Thus later, when concluding in Hebrews 13:13, Paul, perhaps with Moses in mind, said, "Let us go forth bearing Christ's reproach," implying that if their forefathers could do it for Christ so long before his arrival, surely they could do it then, so soon after his opening coming and so near his closing coming. Confer chapter 9 verse 28 and chapter 10 verse 37. Robert Milligan made a very astute point when he wrote, "It may be truly said that all reproach suffered for righteousness' sake since the world began has been suffered for Christ's sake." The reason I find this intriguing is because it makes me wonder if Jesus thought to himself, "How can I not do whatever it takes to save those who wish to be saved after all the suffering men have endured through the centuries in order to bring me here for this very purpose?" The clause, "he looked to the reward," literally means that he looked away from the pleasures of sin and the treasures of Egypt and intently toward the greater riches or the reward to be possessed by bearing up under the reproach of Christ. This reward is an obvious reference to the eternal reward, not the temporal one in the land of Canaan. The eternal reward was finally about to be realized. Check out Revelation 22:12. In other words, Moses exchanged an earthly possession for a heavenly one, a temporal one for an eternal one. Speaking of the reward, it's very likely that Paul was thinking about how these Hebrews had suffered and were suffering the laws of material things because of Christianity. Check out chapter 10, verse 34, as well as Revelation 13, 16, and 17. So they needed just this sort of encouragement from the life of Moses. Verse 27. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Check out verse 23. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Yes, we're still talking about Moses. There's a lot of debate as to which forsaking of Egypt this concerns, whether it was when Moses left at the age of 40 after killing the Egyptian taskmaster, or when he left at the age of 80 with the Hebrews in tow. And I don't have an answer for that. So just leave it at that and let you think about it yourself. The phrase the king here, as in verse 23, is Pharaoh. As far as which Pharaoh Paul had in mind would depend on which forsaking of Egypt by Moses he had in mind. So I don't have an answer for that either. The phrase him who is invisible is clearly an allusion to God or the Messiah, verse 26, both who were of course invisible to Moses as opposed to any of the visible idols of Egypt. Thus Paul's point to these brethren was that faith, not fear, is what needed to prevail among them. Whether they were afraid or not was much less important than whether they obeyed or not. These believers needed to learn to see, or to focus on seeing, what unbelievers couldn't see. After all, that was Paul's point all along. Faith is seeing what can't be seen. Verse 28, continuing with Moses, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. The word for kept actually means to make, hence meaning that Moses instituted the Passover with its attendant blood sprinkling on Israel. So, although no one had ever heard of such a thing occurring before, and although none of the previous 9 plagues had worked, Moses still had faith in God, a faith that prompted him to establish and observe the Passover with the sprinkling of blood in order to keep the death angel from killing any of the firstborn of Israel. Since this letter concerns the things these Jerusalem Christians were facing that led up to the destruction of AD 70, and since history, such as Eusebius, claims that no Christians were killed in Jerusalem's annihilation, it makes one wonder if Paul was again indicating that, if they just have faith and obey as their ancestors did, they would escape the wrath of God. Confer Revelation 3:12, Revelation 14:1, Revelation 22:4. After all, these brethren were also considered firstborn ones. Check out James 1:18, and especially Hebrews 12:23 and the remarks there. The thoughts that we'll get to, of course, in a study before too long. Now, verse 29. In this verse, looking at those whom Moses had in tow as he left Egypt. By faith they, that is the Hebrews, the Israelites, passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. As with verses 11 and 23, I believe this verse is referring to the unwavering faith of Moses, not any faith of the Israelites. Check out Exodus 14:11 through 14. However, if Paul did mean the faith of those Hebrews, as they seemed to face a no-way-out situation, surely these Hebrews, by faith, could do the same thing while facing what seemed to be to them a no-way-out situation. So either Paul was referring to Moses' faith, or to the Israelites' faith, or to the faith of the Israelites led by Moses and his faith. The latter appears to be the idea in the next verse concerning the Israelites and Joshua, Moses' successor. By faith, the Israelites passed through the Red Sea. Again, whether it be Moses' faith or by their faith or both, or their following Moses and his faith. So they passed through the Red Sea by faith. But surely it was only due to their fear of Pharaoh that the Egyptians tried to make it through as well. This is where one can see the difference between those who act out of faith and those who act merely out of fear. So Paul's readers were to learn from Moses, their ancestor, one that they revered as much as they did, that true faith means obeying God no matter how bad things seem to be and no matter what the perceived consequences might be. All right, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. So Paul's moved on a little bit more in time with regard to the Israelites and taking Jericho. Jericho was the first city taken by Israel once she finally arrived in the Promised Land. And though it was a very well fortified city, by faith Jericho's walls simply fell down. Joshua 6:20. This is another case which indicates that God's ways aren't man's ways. Isaiah 55:8 and 9. In other words, apparently as another test for his own people, as well as a statement to all the inhabitants of Canaan, God asked his people to do something that seemed ridiculous. March around the city 7 days, then blow horns and shout on the 7th day to bring the walls down. Can you picture a general having his troops do that today? Wouldn't that just seem ridiculous? So to do this, perhaps with the citizens of Jericho rolling on the ground laughing at them, required a lot of faith. And in this case, there wasn't a recorded word of disbelief uttered by the Israelites. By having faith in and obeying God, they overcame, emerging as victors. But again, perhaps even here, it was their faith in Joshua, whose faith was in God. Either way, faith is still involved, and that's Paul's point. Would God have brought down these walls had Israel not had faith and obeyed? All right, last verse in this study, verse 31. By faith the harlot Rahab, now we're moving on to a different person. By faith Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. She's perfect within the succession of events here, so Paul brings up her and her faith. Rahab is plainly stated to have been a harlot here, not just an innkeeper as some claim. But though a harlot and a Gentile, she, as Tamar, Ruth, and Bathsheba, became an ancestor of the Messiah. At least it seems to be that way according to Matthew chapter 1 verse 5 in a genealogy of our Lord. Why? Because of her righteous treatment toward two of God's people. And why did she take the risk? Because she believed the reports concerning what the God of Israel had done for his people. She knew about their deliverance from Egypt and their crossing of the Red Sea, Joshua 2:8 and following. So she said that Yahweh, not some Jerichoan idol, is God in heaven above and on earth beneath, Joshua 2 verse 11. Furthermore, she knew that the Lord had purposed to give Israel her people's land. So she, unlike the other citizens except her family, with pure motives, yielded to Yahweh's will by willingly and peacefully welcoming and hiding two of his people. In fact, the phrase, not believe, isn't from the common term for unbelief or lack of faith, but from a phrase referring to disbelief which manifests itself in disobedience. In other words, it speaks of the failure on the part of the citizens of Jericho to accept that God was giving their land to the Israelites, manifesting itself in their refusal to surrender. By the way, Rahab's name reflects her people, for it means insolence, violence, and pride. So if the Hebrews Paul addressed could not have as much faith as a Gentile harlot, then shame on them. Besides, if God rewarded this Gentile harlot for her faith, surely he'd reward these Hebrews for their faith and faithfulness. So now I'm going to move to page 320 in order to read to you my translation of the passage we have just studied. So, page 320, beginning with verse 20 of chapter 11. By faith, regarding things now to be fulfilled, Isaac blessed his two sons, Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, while dying and bowing in respect over the head of his staff, blessed his two grandsons by Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when nearing his end, reminded the children of Israel of their promised exodus, giving them a command concerning his bones. By faith, Moses' parents, because they noticed that he was unique to God, weren't deterred by the king's decree from hiding their newborn son for 3 months. By faith, Moses, having reached 40 years of age, disowned the title of the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing to be persecuted along with God's people rather than to enjoy sin for a while, because he considered suffering, abuse for the Messiah to be of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. He was therefore earnestly looking away from Egypt and toward the reception of the messianic reward. By faith Moses, as if actually seeing the unseeable one, and not fearing the fury of the king, left Egypt and remained resolute in his heart. By faith Moses instituted the Passover and the smearing of the blood, that the destroyer might not touch their firstborn sons. By faith Israel passed through the Red Sea as though on dry land, a feat which drowned the Egyptians when they dared to follow. By faith Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and its walls came crashing down. And by faith Rahab the harlot, having welcomed the scouts in peace, didn't perish with those who refused to be persuaded. So, there you have it. This week's audiobook of my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled, that began on page 229, dealing with Hebrews chapter 11, verses 20 through 31. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you another installment of my book next week.